Okay, we'll start again. It's the most difficult session because it's the most important one. It's about financing, so I guess you know what it is. And it's also the most difficult because it's the last one. So sometimes people tend to stay downstairs. So we'll start. We're going to speak about addressing the financial challenges of deployment. And we have a panel which is going to start with David Hart, which is director at IIII, which is a business consulting company which is specialized in sustainable energy, and is also a principal research fellow at Imperial College London. You're going to tell us some of the challenges facing with moving from a fossil energy system into a renewable one, I guess. Thank you. And then I'll present the other ones ongoing.
Thank you very much, Pierre-Etienne. Thank you, everybody else, for coming back from a good coffee session. And particularly thank you to the organizers. Thank you to Bert for giving me 2 weeks' notice to write this presentation and for putting me on at 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. So, very much appreciated. Having said that, I do agree with Pierre-Etienne that this is an extremely important session. I do hope that's what's kept you here, and I think that we're going to have some interesting things to say and some lively debate around how we should move financing and infrastructure forward. I was asked really to set out some of the challenges. I'm going to do that. I'm also going to throw a couple of suggestions, not solutions, in about ways we can think about this slightly differently. And I'd like to probably echo a little bit what Darrell Wilson said in the previous talk, that we need to consider this in a slightly different frame of mind from simply replacing one commodity with another. One slide on E4Tech, because I think many of you will not know who we are, and some of you will associate me much more with Imperial College, which, as Pierre-Etienne says, is still the case. We work in sustainable energy, and we work in areas that are complicated. We like that. So anywhere there is technology risk, business risk, finance and policy risk, that's where we enjoy working with startup companies, with big strategic organizations, with policymakers, and with financiers in particular. And I run all of our hydrogen and fuel cell work, which is absolutely dead center in terms of technology, policy, and business risk. So that's my perspective. And I wanted to start with a little story, talking about where this is coming from. So it's not just that hydrogen has a problem or fuel cells have a problem. Financing new technology is always difficult. It brings risk, it brings additional cost, and there are clear structural barriers that it faces versus what is already out there in the market today. There are also complicated issues such as who gets the benefit versus who pays for the cost, the landlord-tenant issue. And then there are national, local, regional, organizational, structural matters. If you're looking at something like hydrogen and fuel cells, big infrastructure, then it gets harder still. You have stranded assets from the incumbent, and you have some systems dependency and network effects in that if you already have the system, you automatically have benefits because you have customers, because you have cash flow, because you have the ability to invest. And something I want to split out is this difference in financing between, for example, vehicles and infrastructure. The end-use consumer good is quite a different matter from the supporting background service. So it's hard to finance new technology. It's hard to finance clean technology if the only reason you're financing it is its cleanliness. There's a social benefit versus a private cost. That's why the FCH-JU exists. That's why so much of this work is funded, as we heard from Ito-san, by governments, because they need to get some sort of benefit which otherwise nobody will pay for. Energy is a commodity, so you have to find niche markets to make a sustainable business case to be able to raise money. And there's lots of uncertainty. There's uncertainty in the boundary conditions and how they may change, in building a long-term business plan. The policy environment, as we've seen only too well, particularly with solar, can flip-flop. You can't guarantee that you are going to get the money you thought you were going to get. Will customers buy it? And what are the competing solutions? The next question is, are you actually financing the right part of this chain? Have you worked out where the painful part is? who it is who is not making the money. And Darryl made, I think, a very good point when saying, in California, you finance the fueling station operator because very often it's a franchise, it's one person, and they are the person who ultimately needs to feed their family. So if you can give them a sense of comfort, you can actually do quite a lot in terms of greasing the whole chain. And your incentives may have unintended consequences. If you think about what happened in Germany, what is still happening in Germany, it's a magnificent success story in terms of the rollout of renewables. It's also quite a success story in terms of Chinese solar firms. A very busy slide. I'm assuming that these will be distributed later. Hydrogen infrastructure is even harder. So the vehicles may be, in some senses, straightforward. There is a very clear owner of the vehicle, as it were, the OEMs, and they have plans in place, they understand what it is they need to do and what benefits they will get from selling a fuel cell vehicle. Infrastructure is heavily dependent on utilization, and this is always one of the questions that is asked and posed when you get to the chicken and egg problem. How do I make sure that I have enough stations, but at the same time I have enough utilization of assets to give me a sensible return on my investment? And in the short term, there will be gaps. You need to make sure that that long-term plan is in place. But even there, the chain, the risk, has multiple owners. It needs not only demand, it needs demand for people who can make money at every intermediate step. And I think that's something that we are sometimes guilty of not looking at in enough detail. We do the big cash flow analysis, we don't necessarily devolve it right down to that fueling station operator that we were talking about before. And there are things like first mover disadvantage. Somebody puts a lot of money into fueling stations which are not heavily utilized. Other people wait until there's enough infrastructure and enough vehicles out there to make things cash flow positive, and then they come in and build stations themselves. There are possible ways around that. And the final comment is that I have to say, in 15, 20 years dealing with hydrogen and fuel cell issues, we don't always make it easy for ourselves. It's not obvious, it's not simple, but if you are looking for infrastructure financing, then it's probably good to be able to decide on a single refueling pressure, on dispensing mechanisms that are common, on ways of reducing cost that do not require extraordinary purity of hydrogen, which is very difficult to measure and categorize. So I think there are times when we are guilty of making things slightly more uncomfortable than they necessarily need to be. These things have been financed in the past. This is the very big picture. This is if we want to roll out the 1,000 fueling stations that Klaus Bonhoeffer was talking about in Germany, what are some of the financing mechanisms that can take place? First example is that the UK switched from essentially coal-produced gas to North Sea gas when it was found in the 1960s. The way it was able to do that was because this was a nationalized industry. This was somebody who had a guaranteed customer base, they could finance the change, and it was a public benefit that was derived. It was, in fact, a balance of payments benefit as much as anything. The user saw very little difference, other than the fact that it was much more difficult to commit suicide by putting your head in the oven. The next one was mobile phone networks. So that one was not national, that was competing organizations. But the way that was structured was to make it a limited set of customers, a limited set of people who could attack the market. And that meant that they had some level of guarantee about future cash flow, and that enabled them to build a business case and to bid for licenses. And the final one is US rural electrification. This one I find interesting. This is in some ways slightly analogous, but it's to the hydrogen case. But it relied on an infrastructure that was already there and extending it to places where it was difficult to see how you could make an immediate return. And that was done on the basis of aggregating demand. It was based on bringing together intermediaries who were not the end users and providing them with loans to finance the grid rollout so that they could build a risk and cash flow model and take on some of the benefits and some of the upfront costs. And I think that one's one that we certainly ought to think about. Can we learn from some of those historical areas? So there were three things there. There was one about national industries. I don't think we're in that position. I think it may be hard to turn hydrogen and fuel cells into one national industry in each country, so that's probably a difficult one to work with. The other ones were about narrowing down the market and providing limited competition so that people knew what they were getting, and about providing intermediaries who could aggregate demand. The first thing I think is important is to think about how we unify the incentives. The incentives that will help the infrastructure providers are not, in fact, the same for each infrastructure provider, and they're not the same for the OEMs. We need to be more sophisticated about how we break down exactly where the difficult areas are. Clearly, this is starting to happen as the H2 Mobility business plan work gets really underway. People are looking much more detail. But I do think it's worth emphasizing that we haven't looked at that enough. We've said, overall, this is financeable, this is not financeable, there's a gap in the first 5 years, but we don't know exactly where we should be making the most of the limited amount of money that might go into it. And I think it's worth just starting to wonder about non-traditional models. This comes back perhaps to Darrell's point about looking at business models. I'm not focusing on business models here particularly, but if you're building a fueling station, build it with as much modularity as possible so that you do have guaranteed utilization of the assets that you put in initially. Maybe you can cross-finance some of those high and low throughput stations that Dennis mentioned in his speech, where he was saying you're going to have to put a station in there because somebody needs access to it, but it's only going to get 1 car a week, for example. Maybe you can, I don't know, sign up buyers in advance. Say, okay, we're definitely rolling out fuel cell vehicles in 2015. If you sign up in 2013, you get a discount. We know how many customers there might be in a given region. We can start to build an infrastructure based around knowledge of uptake rather than projected uptake. And I think it's extremely important to maintain international dialogue. I was actually at a session at the World Hydrogen Energy Conference, a side session in Toronto in June, where exactly this conversation was taking place. How do we finance the infrastructure? And it had representatives from OEMs, oil companies, the California Fuel Cell Partnership, various things. And there were some interesting ideas that were tossed around there. But we have to be sharing, we have to learn from each other on this one. What works in Japan will not necessarily work in Europe, but it may provide pointers. Some of the options may be more attractive, more obvious, simpler to implement than others. New entrants in markets are likely to see it more positively. So I think one of the reasons that the industrial gas companies are sometimes more enthusiastic than the oil companies are because really this is an opportunity for something like step-out growth rather than an opportunity for cannibalization. Power utilities, they've been relatively reticent until something like the power-to-gas story started to come out. Maybe they could use some of this spare electricity that Darrell was talking about to provide fuel to vehicles. And I think, talking about sort of systems benefits, I think that Darrell's point that nobody's thinking about the system in terms of fueling, I would like to suggest that there are people who are starting to think about that. I think the fuel cell energy plant, which produces hydrogen and electricity, you can move between the two. That's a good way of looking at the business in a slightly different way so that you can modulate your output and get benefits where they can be derived best. And Dennis also spoke about supermarkets. They not only sell 50% of the fuel in the UK, they also have their own fleets. So if you can persuade them into a model that allows them to provide not only hydrogen at a forecourt, but an internal demand, then that might be quite an interesting way to kickstart some of the early rollout. You can bundle the fuel with the vehicle. There are companies who are looking at that already. Maybe you sell somebody a sort of leasing package on a monthly basis. Maybe you put in an infrastructure premium and get people to pay that on a vehicle, and then it's recouped with a little extra charge on the fuel that goes back into the companies. Maybe you put in some sort of insurance into place. So you have a scheme whereby the franchisee who is running a service station actually has the opportunity to say, okay, I will do this on the basis that I get a guaranteed cash flow. There is a bond, there is something put in place which is paid for both by the automotive company and the infrastructure provider, and if the throughput falls, then that insurance is called in. a couple of interesting things which came out of the WEC session that I attended. One I attribute to Sandy Thomas, who you may know has done a lot of thinking on this. Owners' cooperatives. Just a thought to reflect on as we enter the final stage of the afternoon. You get a group of people who are buying fuel cell vehicles. Maybe they'd like to pay a couple of extra thousand and buy their own refueling station. And the final thought, which I am intrigued by, I don't know how easy it will be to implement, is that there was a financier in the room, Bob Shaw, who's spent a lot of money and made some, lost some on hydrogen energy and fuel cells. And he said, look, we're actually talking about pretty small amounts here. And this goes back to Larry Burns' point. We've spent hundreds of millions, billions of dollars on developing the vehicles. Financing an infrastructure isn't that big. Just go and ask Warren Buffett. Go and ask. Why not? So there are some interesting thoughts out there. Think bigger rather than smaller. Don't think about how you finance a $1 million fueling station. Think how you finance the entire infrastructure and go and tell somebody a story which they might like to hear. And with that, I leave you some thoughts to chew on, and I look forward to the thoughts of the rest of the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have not found yet Warren Buffett is not part of the audience, so we need to continue to think a little bit. So Jérôme Chevalier is a managing director of Quilvest, which is a fund of funds. And he spent a lot of most of his career in private equity and merger and acquisition businesses, and he's going to show us how it goes in financing clean tech in the United States and whether or not this model should be interested for fuel cell. And it's interesting to see that the ways are different.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I will try to summarize some thoughts on how we see the business of technology on the one hand and energy on the other hand being financed in terms of innovation. And obviously it is tempting to look at what's going on in the US where these things are moving somehow faster than in Europe. We are investing both in funds with a worldwide scope in each of those two industries. And obviously fuel cells and hydrogen kind of stand at the middle in the middle of those two spaces, technology on the one hand and energy on the other hand. So a few words on why we think and how we see that the US remains really the juggernaut of the financing of innovation today. And I found interesting to show the attrition in terms of value creation of startups between the US on the one hand and Europe on the other hand. So you can see that 13,000 startups have been financed in the US in the last 10 years versus 9,000 in Europe, which is not a huge difference. If you move to the next column, which is the exits, and I'm sorry for looking at that, with the financial eyes, exits meaning either IPO or trade sale to corporate buyers or even write-off. You see 1 company out of 3 in the US sort of triggers an exit versus 1 out of 4 in Europe, which is not too far. But the main difference is when you try to focus on the companies which are being sold for more than $100 million. It's 1 out of 20 in the US versus 1 out of 70 in Europe. And then obviously you have the big winners which are sold for more than $1 billion where the spread sort of shrink a little bit. But it's interesting to see that really where we're somehow lagging behind is in terms of value creation of what we call winners. That obviously is across the whole spectrum of technology, which includes IT, life science, clean tech, and internet. If we try to rationalize this a little bit and find some reasons why the US have been better than us in the last decades, I think the main explanation is that they still gather most of the money to finance these things. Obviously, there are a lot of other reasons. They have excellent clusters. They have good technology, but we do have good technology too. They have probably a reservoir of managers and board members which are more used to stomach that kind of risk than we do. But really, what I think makes the huge difference, and we see that in many deals where it's important to continue to survive, to buy more time, having more money makes the difference. So they have raised about $180 billion to finance innovation across the board through funds in the last 10 years versus 36 billion in Europe. And obviously they've raised that because they have been more successful, and they've been more successful because they've they have probably a better ecosystem to finance all this, and we could dig into that. But it's really a very big differentiator. Now, if we sort of narrow down the scope to what we call clean tech, which is both the generation of electricity, distributed generation of electricity on the one hand, and energy efficiency on the other hand, there are some things that we keep seeing and have seen in the recent years in those spaces. Here you have a matrix which allows us and helps us to follow what's going on in those spaces. On the x-axis, you have the amount of $1 million that have been required in average to finance one of those winners. And on the y-axis, you have the average return that those winners have done for their investors. The size of the bubbles is the numbers of those winners in the last 10 years. And as you can see, life science obviously is the most capital intensive, so it requires an average $75 million to generate a winner, which returns back when it works 4x to the investors. While at the other end of the spectrum, if you look at clean tech, at least until 2009, it seemed to be much more efficient and capital efficient, as you had only 21 deals, but those deals with say $40 million returned 14x to the investors, and that's where came really the hype for that space in the first half of the years 2000. But it's interesting to see that if you add 8 more exits, which happened in the last 2 years or 3 years, the capital intensity increases very sharply as it goes from $40 million per deal to $120 million per deal. So let's try to dig a little bit into this, and that slide seems to be a bit complicated. I'll try to make it simpler. You have three different periods in terms of what really worked, at least for the financial in clean tech, last 10 years or 12 years. First of all, you had the 2002 to 2003 period, where 15 deals that you can see here, such as Enernac or GT Solar, or some German deals too that we all know of, which have been successful at that time. These were very techie deals, the way technology is understood in IT. So with limited amounts of money, say $30 million in equity, these deals generated 15x return, and people thought this was the new gold mine for financial investments in technology. But if you move to the next 4 years, for 2004, from 2004 to 2008, you see only 6 deals which have quote-unquote succeeded, being financed by venture groups, and they absorbed, if I read well, about $90 million each, and generated only 6x of returns, and almost all of these 6 deals were Chinese solar fabs, which were pre-IPO deals, so much more industrial companies, much more capital intensive, much closer, I would say, to what this industry actually is. And this is a trend that the financial investors, which were very excited at the beginning by the easy money, started to feel, and I would even say for them, in many cases, to feel the pain, because these deals are not easy to finance. Then came the third period, 2009, 2011, where you have many of the, some solar deal, some biofuel deals such as Kyer and Amiris, and some also car battery deals such as A123, again, further into capital intensity, almost $300 million required each time in equity to generate 3x. So you see, how this, when you look at that with financial eyes and from the limited number of real winners, the pattern of the successes has evolved in the last 10 years. And that takes us to what we try to discuss as often as we can with corporate groups. We have a strategy of investing with funds to have global partners throughout the world in those two verticals that I mentioned, but also to try to work as closely as we can with corporate groups. And I thank very much our friends from Air Liquide for having invited us today. The idea in that slide is pretty simple. There are three steps in terms of really developing those startups. First of all, you have to have a technology that works, and that's well done at the R&D level. It's about $10 to $50 million to build a pilot. Most of the corporate groups are following that themselves, doing that themselves, and do it very well. Then we see that the big value creation step is really when those technology succeed in gathering the financing of their industrial scale-up, i.e. building a real industrial plant that proves that technology at scale. And that's anywhere between $100 million and $1 billion to really build those fabs and make sure that what worked in the lab actually works in the real life at the scale which matters to the industrial groups. And that's where we try to focus our attention and to find ideas and targets and things interesting. And we think that it's after that step and not before that you've really created value. So who does that and who financed that real scale up of startups? It's not an easy answer to quite a simple question, well, those technologies are, I haven't lined up the technologies that we considered as being part of that scope, but it's in each case almost a different solution, which is a mix of various types of financial investors. Some are really tech investors. And I will not spend too much time into this, but some of the big venture American or European, but mostly American venture funds do some of these clean tech deals and leverage their big platforms, which have already been successful in other spaces such as IT or life science or again internet, and that brings a lot of value. And strangely, that is the kind of funds that the best entrepreneur in clean tech do pick, because what they need is not a higher expertise in what they already know, but they need really the financial muscle that these guys bring to the table. Then you have specialized clean tech funds, you have what we call clean tech scale-up funds, you have the big energy private equity funds, which do mostly conventional energy and do some of these clean tech deals on the side with also very big financial means. Then you have the corporate groups and the governments. But the funds themselves invest each year $30 to $40 billion in those spaces. So I think it's a number which attracts the attention of corporate groups, because it's a number that sort of plays at their scale. Now, if we try to focus a little bit on what the funds bring to the table and what the corporate groups bring to the table, because in many of those deals we think that both have to work together, because the capital intensity of those deals requires expertise, traction, but also financial muscle from both of them. So just to give you a few numbers, we track about almost 1,500 funds across those private equity funds, so technology funds, let's say, and private equity funds across those spaces worldwide, of which about 400 are somehow exposed to clean tech. And as you can see, a little more than half of them are American, but not all of them. And more than 140 have $1 billion under management. So these guys have money, they can do things, they do a lot of mistakes, obviously, as everyone else, but some of the things they do are interesting, and I think it's worth taking time to tracking what they're doing. One example which I think illustrates that statement that I did before, which is that, and this is counterintuitive, it's not necessarily the most specialized funds which are the most successful. If you take 34 companies which have been or are considered as having been successful in the last 12 years, and obviously you know many of those names, it's interesting to see that 82% have been backed by generalist venture capital funds, while only 38% were backed by specialized energy technology funds. And the reason for that is that, again, what matters to the entrepreneurs is more the dry powder that you have, the experience of success that you have already had in other spaces, more than a slightly higher expertise for a financial guy in the spaces you're investing into. One word also on where we see the money going in those spaces. It's interesting to see that the amount of money invested in clean tech is growing and continues to grow in the recent quarters, but it's interesting to see, and in particular in solar, which absorbed most of the money, but also it's interesting to see that in some segments the debt is sort of taking over on equity, which gives, I think, a signal that these industries are starting to mature. Corporate group contribution, I just have one word on what happened in clean tech in the last 10 years. As you can see on the left-hand side, for the rounds of financings which were higher than $50 million, 40% of those rounds included a corporate group. So it's clear that when the checks are big, the corporate groups are required. And I have one last slide on Bloom Energy and the money that went into fuel cells in the last 10 years. As you can see, it has been pretty stable since 2004, anywhere between $200 and $300 million to finance those deals, apart from what had been done by the corporate groups themselves, and one big company which absorbed a significant proportion of that, or went in addition to that, and that includes some Californian tax-paying money, which is Bloom Energy, quite interesting company, quite speculative too.
Thank you, Jérôme.
Thank you.
So we've not found Warren Buffett. I understand that clean tech financing, it's probably a little early or probably too late for other companies, because Bloom Energy took 7 years. You need to stay 7 years, and it's not yet IPO. No. So now we move to another approach on the subject, which is the vision of the French government, which has established a general program, which is called the Programme d'Investissement d'Avenir. And we have the chance to have Yvan Faucheux with us, which is currently the Energy and Circular Economy Program Director at this cell, which is directly reporting to the Prime Minister. And he's going to tell us some very lively thoughts on everything we've said today.
Okay.
Thank you, Yvan.
Thank you, Pierre Frank. Ladies and gentlemen, so first of all, sorry for my pidgin English. So if there is some sentence that you don't understand, you just raise your hand and say, do not understand. Secondly, I haven't met any slide, so my poor English won't be counterbalanced by pictures. First of all, just to make 3 reminders about fuel cell and hydrogen. The first of all is that the French government and the European government have been committed to decarbonize their economy. So this is a commitment. Whatever you think about climate change or whatever, you have to achieve a decarbonization of the economy. And in this frame, hydrogen is one of the solutions for storing energy. and is not the only solution. Even if we think that the future of energy will be made of several technology or several solutions, we are not already convinced, and I must say it, that hydrogen will be the solution. And we don't know exactly what will be the space for hydrogen in the future energy system. So first of all, convince us. The second problem is infrastructure development. Infrastructure is a bottleneck because big infrastructure makes things cheaper, but big infrastructure costs a lot. So even if you don't look at it as a financing problem, in terms of landscape resources, especially in towns, when you have several infrastructure for hydrogen, it takes space. So you have to manage the competition between different technology, not only in finance, but also in landscape programming. Third of all, hydrogen still has to show its competitive advantage related to mass market and especially to transportation market. If you want to have a strong effect on the decarbonization of your economy, you have to address mass market. And the biggest mass market in France, which is already carbonized, is the transportation market. So if hydrogen is not a solution for transportation and mass transportation, it is not a point. However, the investment for the French Strategic Investment Programme, which has 35 billion euro, among which 5 billion are dedicated to energy, still considers that hydrogen is a strategic technology to be developed, also with electricity, also with other technology. But I must remind everybody in this room that if Europe has been a pioneer in sustainable growth, Europe is today a pioneer in public finance crisis. So we don't have a lot of money, we will have to make some choice, and we will have to be convinced that the choice that we make are based on a real comprehension of the rationale of economy. And as of today, we have, I would say, clear indices or clear view on the fact that hydrogen may be a good choice for the future of the French and the European energy, but we still have to be totally convinced. The second point is that our approach is to look at operational experimentation to measure the reality of the hydrogen solution. I would say that big speech or macroeconomic speech, it's very good. It shows us where we have to go in 20 years. But next year, or in 2 years, or in 3 years, we will have to invest in operational experimentation. So what we expect is, first one, a clear view on what hydrogen will be in 20 years, but we also need a clear and operational experimentation. And the third point I would like to point out is that the financing of infrastructure between small operational experiment and the bright future that hydrogen will bring to Europe is also a key point, especially when public financing are very rare and very low. And I would like to stress out that we are looking at innovative way of financing this infrastructure. Infrastructure, if there is a huge deployment, thank you for once. If you have a huge deployment of infrastructure, it will have to get access to finance market at a big scale. So you have to think about what are green bonds, how can you sell green bonds, how can you guarantee green bonds, and how the public sector, which will be still committed at the beginning of the deployment, can put on the table the less money as possible. We are a little bit traumatized by the photovoltaic experiment. where we have put a lot of money on the table for a small amount of electricity produced, and 95% of the equipment bought in China and in India. And this is what we don't want to see in the future. The last point for my speech is that when you look at the rationale for the hydrogen economy, it is very clear that you cannot do it or you cannot achieve it at a national level. We in France have national specificity. First of all, we have Paris, we have all the pleasure and the joy in Paris, but we have also a nuclear power plant, which will account for a significant part of the production of our electricity in the future. But if we go to hydrogen, with the specificity, we cannot go alone. And the European approach for financing infrastructure at a huge scale and at a large scale cannot be, I would say, self-sufficient only at a national level. So this is why being here with you in a European space or at a European level is really a key point for hydrogen. I would like to point out that we are not convinced that a national policy in hydrogen can be sufficient to launch an industrial sector which can be competitive in the long term. Finally, I would say that, in Europe, it is a pain to be in Europe because you have to speak English when you are French. And I would say, but I would add up with a quote from a German policymaker who said that political action is to take decision today for our children and even for our grandchildren. And I think that if we look too much at the short term and at the financial crisis and at the, I would say, short return on investment, hydrogen has no chance to perform. We have to put the hydrogen technology in the long term in terms of society, in the long term in terms of deployment, but also in the long term in terms of financing. And long-term financing, markets are not very used to, so we have to be very, very innovative. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yvan. So I understand that the charm of the program is that you have execution agencies. Yes. So now that you've said that it was not so easy to justify the case in the next 10 years, that you needed to do some operational experience in the next 3 years, and that you needed to be innovative, I guess it's Daniel which is going to say, oh, you're going to be innovative as scientific director of the ADEM agency, which is a large energy agency in France financing large deployment projects. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you for your introduction and thank you for the challenge. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First, I will focus on, on the toolbox to support research, development, demonstration, and innovation in fuel cell and hydrogen field. Maybe just a few words before to introduce ADEM. ADEM is an agency with 1,000 people all over the country. The basis budget, normal budget of ADEM is around 600 and 700,000 euros per year. I said normal because sometimes we have some additional budget to manage. For example, we are an operator of the Investissement d'Avenir. Yvan has presented this program, and it's a real opportunity to develop some new way or new innovative technologies, especially in the field of energy and environment, which is a field in which are the missions of ADEM. So, firstly, I would like to illustrate the French fuel cell and hydrogen story by different steps that have mobilized various tools. So you see the steps, the period are the same that we have seen since this morning with different presentation, but always three times, 3 or 4. First period is a launching program in France. The tool was not so many money, but the tools was a network named PACO for pile à combustible, in which projects were elaborated, were accredited and were funded by 3 sources: Ministry in charge of research, Ministry in charge of industry, and ADEME. And we can say today that numerous projects or teams have their roots in this period. Second period, in 2005, 2007-2008, was the great period for hydrogen and fuel cells. It's the creation of the National Agence Research in France. Maybe a reason is an explanation was chairing the previous session, because at this period Bernard Froisse was responsible for the hydrogen program of the research agency. The third period is a little bit difficult because it's the period where the involvement of industry, of car automotive industry decreased in France, and the budget decreased too. Maybe it's not the only reason. To me, 2008 is also the first years of the crisis, and some difficulties in the public funds occurred at this period. In 2008 begins the real need for demonstration, and it's also the need where the flagship project Horizon Energy hydrogen was launched, led by Air Liquide, and it's a great point of turning because the point of view changed at this time, and the project were more market-oriented and a little bit less research and knowledge production-oriented. So during this period, some R&D continue, of course, but with less, at a lower level, and maybe with also more turn to the Europe and the Europe FP7 funds. So more recently, the French community around the association AFIPAC, it's a French association on hydrogen, have produced a roadmap, have identified priorities, and have proposed some action plan. And we have the chance that this initiative corresponds with Investissement d'Avenir on Investment for Future. The project hydrogen and fuel cell are eligible at the Investissement d'Avenir. I didn't say many things about the financial tools used. In the first period, we have mainly grants with a rate ratio between 40 and 50%. It's a classical level. For demonstration project, it's a refundable advances, and you have the presentation this morning by Laure Renard of the HOSEO health system. And with Investissement d'Avenir, Investment for the Future, we have a new tool, new for us, ADEME, the possibility to invest in equity capital. It's a new, very interesting level to invest in innovation. So the priorities are, it's not a surprise, are clear, close of the structuration of the day. We have 5 pillars. I won't spend a long time. Just first one on convergence of hydrogen and renewable energy. We have seen today many examples and explanations of this topic. The second pillar with we call new generation electromobility has a specificity in France that it's clearly close of the expansion of the electric vehicle market on the strategy on hydrogen energy in production, in mobility, is in accordance with our priority to electricity, to electric vehicle. The third pillar is oriented to stationary applications. Fuel cell and hydrogen at the heart of eco-district and smart energy grids. We have some, we launched some calls with this, on this topic. The first pillar is also turned to international markets. All the markets is not in France. You have seen, you have heard that France is not yet a leader on the market for hydrogen and fuel cell. Maybe it become one day, but today it's necessary to be careful, to be attentive in market abroad. And the five pillars is classical. It's all the cross-sector, code, standards, regulation, training, education. It's not the same. And in all the calls we have launched, we have asked that this pillar was addressed in all the projects which are proposed for support. Back for example, on the priorities for mobility, I've said that in accordance with the French support for electric vehicle, we focus for maybe with smaller cars. That's the presentation we have seen this afternoon. Typically, the model is a fleet vehicle with the volunteer to combine in a hybrid car the power of the battery and the energy of the fuel cell. And in fact, to give just an example, on the paper, one can say that with a pack of 50 kilograms of battery, so something like 50 kilowatt, and with 15 kilowatt fuel cells, we have something that could work. And is the target in the first time on which we are focusing. And in our model, this type of car is associated with a local refuel station, not necessarily in the first time with a large dissemination of refueling station in the country. But with the time, there's a smaller station might be connected. Okay, just to say in a very short time that in France there is some people involved in fuel cell and hydrogen. You've seen it. It's more than 100 people, and we have world-class labs in CEA, in CNRS, and it's important to say that. We have also some leaders in the large companies. We have some very active SMEs. There is, one can say there is a still room, and new actors are welcome, of course. And just to finish, Yvon spoke about Investissement d'Avenir program, the decarbonized energy program. In this program, we have had a call for hydrogen in general on the basis of the scheme with the 5 pillars that I've presented before. The result is today that we have 10 projects in instruction. These projects are for half on mobility, for another half on production, on the stationary application, one on the micro fuel cell. On the amount, the total amount of the project is 120 million euros. It will allow, I hope, that next year you can see more blue dots on the French cars of the demonstration operation. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. So Yvan said just before Daniel that there was an execution harm on the local side, on the national side, and also another one which was to transfer the subject to Europe. So this is good because Europe is there as well. So Jean-David Malo is head of unit financial engineering at the DG RTD, and he's working and he's been working in developing the new financing scheme that Horizon 2020 is supposedly going to put in place and to set at disposal of the needs that we have. He's going to explain how it's going to help us. Thank you, Jean-David.
Thank you very much, Pierre-Etienne. Good afternoon, or good evening now, ladies and gentlemen. I will try to be as brief as possible because I suppose that a lot of you are expecting for the beginning of the weekend also. But I will try to be also very clear and frank on what are our proposals, what is feasible, what are the timeline, and what is envisaged at this stage at the level of the European Commission on the research and innovation part, but also in cooperation with especially our colleague of DG Move and DG Energy in the field of fuel cell and hydrogen. First of all, as I said to Pierre-Etienne a few minutes ago, normally my first slide was saying doing more with less. Because the purpose of my speech is to talk about not the substance, but to talk about the means, money. And as it was rightly said by Mr. Faucheux a few minutes ago, we are currently in a period of budgetary constraint for member states. And it's very likely, despite the wish of the Commission, perhaps also despite the wish of the European Parliament, that the budget at EU level will certainly not increase. We hope it will not be the case, but we know, and we have to be very aware of this, that it will be difficult at least to maintain the level of the budget at EU level. However, this is also taking into account this kind of constraints that the Commission considers that the use of financial instrument is more relevant than ever, because financial instrument has a lot of advantages. And I would like, in the beginning of my presentation, to talk about this before entering more into the details. When we are talking about financial instruments, we are not talking about grants or public procurement or prices or any of this kind of financial supports that you may find at national or EU level. When we are talking about financial instruments, we are talking about, let's say, debt financing and equity financing, to make it simple. We are talking about loans, we are talking about guarantee, counter-guarantees on the one hand, and on the other hand, we are talking about equity financing. In fact, very surprisingly, at the EU level, we are using financial instruments for a decade. But very surprisingly, we had no rules on how to implement them. It's the first time that in our future financial regulation, we will have rules regarding financial instruments. But when are we using financial instruments? The first thing, why first are we using them? First, as I told you, because it's relevant to do so, especially in this kind of very dire situation. Second, because they have a lot of benefits. First, they have a leverage benefits. You can do more with less money if you are designing them well and if they are delivering. Second, they also have a kind of policy leverage because by definition we are not working ourselves. We are not implementing ourselves financial instruments. We are working with intermediaries. We are working, for example, with the European Investment Bank or the European Investment Fund, but we are working also with some funds of funds or venture capital funds, and we intend to do so more and more in the future. By doing this, even if by nature we are working with the principle of alignment of interests, we are transferring to the intermediaries our policy objective. And last but not least, because we have to be very modest and humble. I am a civil servant. I'm not a professional of investment. The ones who are able to do so are indeed investors. So we are using the know-how of the intermediaries with whom we are working in order to maximize the impact, the policy impact we are looking for. When are we using them? We are using them when we are facing three cumulative conditions. First, we are in front of a suboptimal investment situation. And it's evident that it is typically the case in your case. We are using them if indeed we have an expected EU value added. And there also, I will not repeat again what has been said several times today by different persons, we have here an EU value added. And last, we are using them if indeed we are able to design something with a leverage effect. Because if you have no leverage effect, let's be clear, it's a grant system. So let's not use financial instruments if indeed it's better to use a grant system. We are doing so now for a very long period. I've just mentioned this here on this slide, several of them, in the field of supporting SMEs and innovation in the broad term. What we have achieved for the time being is more than quite, it's very positive in terms of impact. I just would like to develop one more because it has a direct link with your topic and your scene, and you will understand why in the second stage. One of them is the risk-sharing finance facility. The risk-sharing finance facility is nothing else than a loan system. It's a debt financing instrument where we are providing, in fact, a guarantee to intermediaries, to a loan provider, in this case, this is EIB or commercial banks, which are providing loans to either large corporate, mid-caps, or SMEs who are investing in R&D and innovation. It's a demand-driven instrument. In other words, you have no focus in a very particular field. And it's a system where, in fact, the objective, which was set up by the European Council in 2005 at the request of the French president at that time, Mr. Jacques Chirac, was to leverage an additional 10 billion euro in order to support private funding. We are covering with the RSFF any kind of costs which are carried out, in fact, by companies from basic research to innovation. One of the difficulties that we had for the time being is that due to legal constraints, I will not enter into the details, the innovation part can only be taken in charge by the EIB. We are taking in charge the rest. Why? Because the RSFF is part of the FP7 for research and innovation and technical development, and we have another program, the CIP, which is dealing with innovation. So for legal reasons, we cannot cover innovation ourselves. It's an instrument which worked very well because you have here, in fact, the last figures. We have been able to deliver on the market in 5 years and a half more than 10 billion euro already. And the fields which are covered, as you can see, and I repeat, on a demand-driven approach, shows that in the field of energy there is an important demand. And if you make a link now with the set plan technologies, and especially with the European Industrial Initiative of the set plan, some of the projects which are supported currently by the RSFF, in fact, are fully in line with the set plan. So you have here a list of them. The level of support that has been provided, that has been invested by the companies which are behind this project, is already superior to 5 billion euro. You can see that, of course, it's focusing for the time being more on solar or wind energy. But more and more, we are coming to the electricity part of the set plan. And I would like to tell you that here you have not, in this slide, the name of Better Place initiative, but Better Place has been supported and is supported by the RSFF currently. I'm saying this, you will understand why in a minute. The RSFF is indeed providing support, potentially to small projects, but also to already large-scale demonstration projects, and in particular, first-time industrial application of new technologies. Of course, one of the conditions is that you need an RDI dimension in the project. If you have no RDI dimension, no research and technological development or innovation dimension, therefore the project is not eligible, so you have to go to another place. But this is something that certainly will change post-2013. Our approach, because it's demand-driven, is technology neutral. And I mentioned Better Place a few minutes ago, because technology neutral does not mean that we are not ready to invest in any technology because we don't want to make a choice. By definition, if you are technology neutral, you have to give a chance to any possibility. We have given a chance to Better Place projects, so there is no reason why we will not give a chance to fuel cell and hydrogen, and I will come to this at the end of my presentation. Of course, the objective is to have an instrument which is also able to be combined with other public sources of funding. Legally speaking, it is feasible already today, but for the time being, it never appeared. But this is something that we will incentivize in the future, especially in order also to be able to combine lending and equity financing at various levels, but also to embed long-term investors, and especially, for example, some initiative like the Marguerite Fund. I will not go into the various next slide in details. All these slides will be shared and disseminated to all of you. I just would like to go immediately, in fact, to what we have in mind for the future in this context. We have, in fact, proposed last November a set of programs for the next budgetary period, what we are calling the next multi-financial framework, the next MFF. In the field of support of research, technological development, and innovation, a lot of financial instruments are proposed, in fact. Here on this slide, we have tried to summarize, in fact, the various sources of support that we are proposing in various programs. First, of course, in Horizon 2020. In Horizon 2020, I will come in a second more in details on this. We are proposing to commit 4 billion euro to support financial instruments at the EU level, both on equity and on debt. In cooperation with our colleagues in charge of competitiveness and SMEs, a new COSME program. But I would like here, in particular, to highlight the fact that we would like to work also in close conjunction with other financial instruments, and in particular with the one which are foreseen under Connecting Europe. Because here there is, by nature, a possibility of cooperation between the RDI part and then the deployment part. And it's obvious that what will be proposed under Horizon 2020 in particular, and what will be under Connecting Europe facility, in particular in the transport and in the energy part of CEF, must be exploited as far as possible. I'm mentioning also here something very important, especially if you have in mind, and I know that you have that in mind, the idea of a pilot action covering several countries. The use of financial instruments in the structural funds will be deeply increased. And what we have proposed, at least at the level of the Commission, is that in the future there will be the possibility for a region, for a managing authority or regional managing authority, to invest outside its territory if it considers it is in its interest. Sorry. So therefore you may imagine that, I don't know, an example like this one, an important German land may agree to use a part of its structural fund to be topped up in a common pot in order to support a specific financial instrument covering not only this land, but also other region of Europe or other country in Europe in the context of a pilot action. So what we are proposing is to support, together with our COSME program colleagues, first, equity financing. So in other words, the idea is to support directly funds of funds on one hand and VC funds on the other end, to develop with them, in fact, potentially in generalist fund, but also on specific and thematic fund, a common policy and investment policy. We will do it with our COSME program because on our side, we would like to focus, and it's quite logical, on the early stage, and they would like to focus on the growth stage. But I mean, the reality of investors is a bit different. You have a lot of funds which are covering the two stages. So we will do it together for that reason. On the debt part, we will propose also two instruments, one for SMEs and small mid-caps being more or less the double size of an SME, so in other words, 500 person in total, where we will provide loans, guarantees, and counter-guarantees, working here, in fact, with banks, with development banks, and also with guarantee societies. More important, we will continue to have a kind of a RSFF program for large corporates and larger mid-caps, but with the idea to expand, in fact, this instrument and to be able, with this instrument, to support a part, not the whole, but a part of some deployment infrastructure if they are RDI driven. So, very quickly, I mentioned the budget, so I will not repeat it here. The only thing that I would like to add here is that, and it's important for you, is that we are talking about 4 billion on our side, Horizon 2020, but in fact this 4 billion may be increased by other part of the Horizon 2020 program. For example, you may imagine that in the energy societal challenge, they can decide that it is relevant to do something in particular using financial instruments, and therefore they could take a part of their budget and to add it to the other financial instrument program. So, allow me to conclude by something which is more focused on the particular work currently carried out by the GTI fuel cell. And it is a decision that has been taken by the steering committee of the risk-sharing finance facility last week. The key problem we are facing here, I mean, it was said already by the first speaker of this session, is that we have to find a tour de table. Let's be clear among us. What we are looking is money. How to ensure the deployment of the infrastructure. The infrastructure is indeed the key problem because OPEX, I mean, operational expenditures are not really an issue. And therefore, the key question is how to create a kind of financial mix, certainly using debt financing, certainly using equity financing, more than certainly, and it's a personal opinion, embedding long-term investors especially with this kind of program where you will have only a return after 15 or 20 years. If you have not long-term investors embedded with you, don't expect that commercial banks will come. They will come perhaps later on, but certainly not at the very beginning, even if you have some very attractive incentive. So you need long-term investors. But this being said, we have decided in the steering committee of the RSFF to create a new activity in this program, which is called technical and financial advice, in order, in fact, to prepare projects for a future assessment in terms of potential support. And last week, the 4th of October, three big projects, a big initiative has been identified. The first one is on tuberculosis, the second one is a big infrastructure of the S3 roadmap list, and the third one is the GTI fuel cell and hydrogen for the deployment of infrastructure. So, in this context, the steering committee of the RSFF, where DG Move is present, where DG Energy is present, which is shared by DG Research and Innovation, but also with our colleague of the EIB and the EIF at equal share. At unanimity, they have decided to do something in particular for fuel cell and hydrogen. And in particular, two actions has been required to the EIB. The first one is to advise on possible financing options and requirements which will be suitable for building pilot hydrogen refueling infrastructure in Europe. And the second one goes a step further, because it is advising the appropriate financing structures and joint instruments, and in the context of what I present you a few minutes ago, it's quite important, that fund indeed the deployment if we have a policy decision in this field. I just would like to conclude by just giving you another set of data. We are in a period of severe budget constraints, but at the same time, member states have decided to increase the capital of the European Investment Bank by 10 billion euro. This increase of capital, which is without precedent in history, will give the possibility from next March for the EIB to be able to leverage an additional 10 billion euro per year, 20 billion euro per year for the next 3 years. In other words, they will have the possibility, but also the political obligation, to deliver 20 billion in addition per year in the next 3 years. So in total, 60 billion euro. And they will have to do it in 4 fields: innovation and skills, SMEs, infrastructure, and clean energy. I stop there.
So there's still some work, but I understand there is some hope. We are close to the end of that session on the assembly, so I don't want to retain you too much, but perhaps you have a couple of questions to our panel speakers. You have a question, so the panel has a question.
Yes, sorry for butting in. It's really a question for Jean-David. You mentioned that there has to be a policy benefit, which is very clear. And I just wanted to bring up some modelling which I've seen recently, which I think is very interesting, which suggests that, and this is for the UK, but you can generalise, if you are looking to meet 2050 CO2 targets, and you're looking to do so in a least cost framework, then if you allow a model free choice, it will choose to invest in expensive hydrogen technologies quite early on in order to realize future benefits. If you restrict it from choosing hydrogen technologies, it costs £43 billion more to achieve those 2050 CO2 targets. Does that sort of, what if we don't do this, come into the thinking of the Commission?
I'm sure. In my unit and in my directorate, not, because we are not in charge of this part of the policy. Huh? So I will certainly not answer on behalf of my colleagues in charge of the energy policy and the transport policy in this field. But this being said, of course, we are each time taking into account any kind of study of this one. We are working, even when we are elaborating financial instruments of this kind that I just present, which are for those one purely demand driven, we are basing our reflection on ex-ante impact assessment based on study which are realized sometimes in one country, sometimes in covering several countries. So I'm quite sure that this kind of evidence that you mentioned are taken into account by our colleagues.
Thank you. Questions? No, you had enough. Ah, okay, one question.
I think we have heard extremely interesting and enthusiastic presentation, but I'm not able, I don't know if the audience is able to see how to link them. For example, what's the link between a manager of funds and the project that he has present, the demand of our sector to finance refilling infrastructure, and the project of the that the Commission wants to launch for the new financial perspective? Or could they be articulate, or do they have to work in parallel for different aspects of our sector need?
I don't want to monopolize the...
Jérôme will give his vision, because I think he's got a very different view on the subject.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understood exactly the question you asked, sorry, in terms of how you asked how the various angles that we've used today combine. Is that what you...
Is it attractive for you what he's saying is going to put in place?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's very attractive, because I see some angles to finance further industrial steps of projects that are clearly lacking today, and preventing some very interesting technologies to reach the scale that they should reach. So it's extremely difficult to come from a good idea to a technology, and from a technology to a pilot, and from a pilot to an industry. So yeah, I think it's right on spot, and I'm very glad that I've seen that today.
I will make a less politically correct answer to this question, as usual. In the past, the public sector used to finance the wealth and the growth of private actors. If you look at the photovoltaic sector, Europe has spent a huge amount of public money to make Chinese company, but not only Chinese company, very successful deal. At the French level, there is a 900 million euro deal made by one personal person when he sold his company. So the new approach we are trying to put in place with Investissement d'Avenir is to seek the co-investment with the private sector. If there is a public investment sequenced with a private investment, you are fairly sure that as civil servants are not very clever people, especially in financial matters, that somebody will take advantage, and the guy who is going to take advantage is 99% the private sector. If you seek the co-investment pari passu between the public and the private sector, you are sure that when somebody loses, everybody loses, and when somebody wins, everybody wins. And we are clearly seeking, I would say, in every deal and in every project, this kind of co-investment. So this is for the answer between private and public. And then the other question is that the public sector is having a lot of initiative for financing at European level, at national level, at regional level, at local level, at communal level. I would say in at the house level, I don't know. And people always ask to have a coordination between the public financing. It's very hard because the interests are diverging very quickly. If you just look at EADS and British aerospace, you can see that even if everybody is clearly conscious that the European sector of defense is a European common interest, when you go to and now who is going to have a seat at the council, the board, on whatever of the future structure, it explodes. So my feeling is that we will still have a different level of public financing. It's not very coordinated, but at the end of the road, every project has a chance to find his own financing with the public intervention.
Just 2 minutes. Answering your question. First, what we have proposed is something new in the sense that what we would like to build is a real continuum in the support of companies. I mean, for the time being, at the EU level, we had something very fragmented. I mean, we had the R&D part, we stopped, we had no link with the possibility to support startups, and then you have no link for the growth stage, you have no link for the subsequent stage. So now the approach, and this is the reason why we would like to develop things together, and it's linked also to what Mr. Faucher said regarding the cooperation between various public actors. What we are doing with our enterprise colleagues is to cover the needs all together and the full spectrum. Second, we don't believe that it's relevant to develop a specific instrument per theme. What we need is instruments which are flexible enough in order to have in front of us a kind of financial toolbox where we can adapt the use of them according to the needs of a specific sector or a specific theme. And last remark, being there not politically correct. I don't believe, even if I know that it's not necessarily the position of some of my colleagues within the Commission, especially DG Competition, I don't believe that in all the cases, in all areas, there is a need for a pari passu approach. I do believe that in certain cases, we have to provide incentive upfront or upstream or downstream to the various investors. I mean, we are not at the level of the Commission or at the level of a national administration there to make profit. We are there to deliver some policy objectives. So maybe we can think in certain areas how we can incentivize private actors, especially private investors, in order to come in a specific area where by nature, for the time being, the attractivity is not there. So if you don't bring them a sugar, I'm not sure that they will immediately come.
So we need to wait for the end of the assembly to have some politically incorrect speeches, so it's getting very interesting. But I think we're going to stop there. So perhaps, Bert, you want to conclude the assembly for the session. We're finished. Thank you very much.